Stepdad married my mom before she passed. Now HE wants her estate, but he has no idea who actually owns it. Before we continue, I noticed that over 90% of you are not subscribed. So hit that subscribe button to never miss out on uploads. Alright, here's the deal. My mom passed away 6 months ago, and while we all knew it was coming, nothing really prepares you for it. The hardest part wasn't even the grief. It was what came after, because almost immediately my stepdad started sniffing around like he was next in line to inherit everything. He's been acting like the man of the house, making decisions, taking control, and dropping hints about what your mother would have wanted, like he's suddenly the keeper of her legacy. But here's the twist. The estate he's trying to get his hands on, it's not hers anymore, and it sure as hell isn't his. It's mine. Every piece of it. He just doesn't know that yet. Let me back up. My mom was a single parent for most of my life. My biological dad wasn't around, and honestly, we didn't miss him. It was just the two of us, and we had a good life. She worked hard, raised me right, and always made sure I had what I needed. We didn't have much growing up, but what we did have was earned. Eventually, she bought a small house in a decent neighborhood. Nothing fancy, but it was hers. Paid off over time, no mortgage, no co-signers, just her name on the deed. That house became our whole world. Every birthday, every holiday, every late-night heart-to-heart happened in that living room. So when I finally got a decent job and started making real money, the first thing I did was pay to renovate the place. New roof, remodeled kitchen, central air, the works. I told her it was a gift. She cried. That was the kind of relationship we had. Then came Brian. He met my mom through mutual friends when I was already in my early 20s and living on my own. At first, I didn't think much of it. My mom deserved companionship. She was still relatively young, had a good sense of humor, and after years of raising me on her own, I figured she'd earned a shot at happiness. Brian seemed decent at first. He was polite, made her laugh, showed up to family dinners, and even brought her flowers. But something about him felt calculated. He didn't talk much about himself, and when he did, it was vague, stories that didn't add up, past jobs that shifted depending on who was listening. Still, she was happy, so I kept my suspicions to myself. They got married after 2 years of dating. Quiet courthouse ceremony, no big reception. I attended out of respect, but kept my guard up. Mom asked me to trust her judgment, so I did. I figured if anything went sideways, I'd step in. What I didn't know was that things were already starting to slide behind the scenes. Shortly after the wedding, Brian quit his job, or rather, retired early. No one really knew what he did to begin with, but suddenly he was at the house 24/7 handling things while my mom worked from home. It started small, him organizing the garage, painting the porch, stuff like that. But then I noticed her behavior shifting. She started second-guessing herself more, asking his opinion on every little thing, and slowly, but surely, the house started reflecting more of him and less of her. New furniture that she wasn't sure she liked, shelves filled with his collectibles, not hers. I kept visiting, kept smiling through it, but I could feel it happening. He was nesting in a place that wasn't his, and worse, he was treating it like he'd earned it. Then my mom got sick. It came out of nowhere, a diagnosis that took everything from her in under a year. She went from working full-time and gardening every weekend to being confined to a hospital bed in the living room. I was there constantly, taking her to appointments, managing her meds, cooking, cleaning everything. Brian? He was there too, but not in the way you'd expect. He acted like the administrator, not the husband. Always telling the nurses what to do, questioning doctors, making passive comments about how expensive everything was. I chalked it up to stress. I tried to give him grace. I figured grief makes people act strange. But I started noticing things. One day I opened the file cabinet where my mom kept her documents, tax returns, her will, property deeds, and found it rearranged. Not missing, just different. Her copy of the house deed was gone. I didn't confront him right away. I made a copy of my own and stashed it in my apartment. I'd had my name added to the deed 2 years ago when I refinanced the renovation in my name. She insisted it stay a joint title. Said it was our home, ours. And Brian? He had no clue. After she passed, things got cold. Brian didn't cry at the funeral. Didn't say much to me except she was one of a kind. And then disappeared. For a few weeks, I didn't hear from him at all. Then I showed up at the house to gather a few personal things, photos, books, keepsakes, and found that he'd changed the locks. When I called him, he said, "We need to respect boundaries now. This is my home." That was the moment I knew we were going to war. After the locks were changed, I didn't respond with emotion. I didn't call him back, didn't demand to be let in, didn't threaten legal action. I just hung up and sat with it. I already knew Brian didn't have the legal right to bar me from that house. He may have played the role of grieving husband, but he had never once looked into who actually owned the property. That was his first mistake. His second was underestimating how much documentation I already had in place. 2 years before my mom passed, she and I had gone through the process of transferring the title into both our names, me as the primary, her as the secondary. At the time, she wanted the security. She said she didn't want some stranger walking off with everything if anything ever happened to her. She'd watched enough families fall apart over inheritance disputes, and she didn't want me to be one of those sons left with nothing. So we made it legal. She added my name, notarized and recorded. Clear as day. Brian knew none of this. When she died, he assumed, as many like him do, that marriage gave him an automatic claim, that a ring and a certificate granted him ownership of everything she left behind. What he didn't realize was that marriage gave him access, not rights. And the moment she passed, his access ended. He just didn't know it yet. After that call, I gave him space. Let him get comfortable. Let him think he had won. I heard from a few family friends that he'd started making changes, repainting the bedroom, replacing her garden with gravel. He even posted on Facebook thanking people for their support as I rebuild my life in the home we built together. That part almost made me laugh. He hadn't paid a dime toward that house, hadn't even contributed to the groceries. He moved in after it was fully paid off and lived rent-free under the protection of a woman who didn't believe in making waves. Now he was pretending it was his foundation. I waited exactly 6 weeks before making my next move. During that time, I met with a probate attorney just to cover my bases. He reviewed the deed, reviewed the estate filings, and confirmed what I already knew. Brian had no legal claim to the house and no standing to contest it. There was no will naming him a beneficiary, no transfer on death clause, no trust, nothing. All he had was a name on a marriage license and a toothbrush in a bathroom he no longer had any legal right to use. The attorney sent a formal letter. Nothing aggressive, just a polite but firm notice stating that the property was not part of my mother's estate, that it was legally co-owned, and that with her passing, all rights had transferred to me as the surviving title holder. He was given 30 days to vacate or respond with legal representation. He didn't respond. Instead, he called me. For the first time since the funeral, I saw his name pop up on my screen. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message. His tone had changed. No more performative grief, no more cool authority. Just irritation masked as confusion. Hey, I got some kind of letter? Something about ownership? I don't know what's going on, but I think we should talk before lawyers get involved. I thought we were handling this like adults. I didn't return the call. 2 days later, he emailed. Short, clipped, trying to sound professional. I received a notice that you're claiming full ownership of the property. I'd appreciate it if we could discuss this calmly. I was married to your mother. I lived in that home. We need to find a fair path forward. He was scrambling. I could see it in every sentence. Because for the first time since she passed, he was realizing he wasn't in control, that he wasn't entitled to the very thing he'd tried to claim as his own, that maybe, just maybe, he'd overplayed his hand. A week later, I drove by the house, just to drive by. I didn't stop, didn't park, just wanted to see what he'd done. The front yard was bare. My mom's rose bushes, one she'd planted herself 15 years ago, were gone. In their place was a gravel strip and a cheap plastic patio set. The porch swing was replaced by a bench with a Bluetooth speaker bolted to it. Every bit of her had been scrubbed away. That was the last emotional tether I had to that house. And that was when I knew I wouldn't just be removing him. I'd be reclaiming everything. I sent a second notice. This one came with a deadline. The second notice wasn't polite. It wasn't aggressive either, but it was firm, final, and delivered through official channels. My attorney drafted it as a formal eviction notice. 30 days from receipt to vacate the premises or face legal removal. No more ambiguity. No more suggestions. This was a demand backed by every relevant document he hadn't known existed. It cited the deed, the law, and my rights as sole legal owner. The envelope was hand-delivered and signed for. That same night, I got another voicemail from Brian. This time, he sounded rattled. No irritation now, just that careful, defensive tone people use when they know they're losing something they thought they could bully their way into keeping. He said we were family, that my mom would be ashamed of what I was doing, and that I was being cruel by putting him out in his time of grief. He didn't mention the ownership. He didn't deny the legality of the notice. He just tried to reframe the situation in emotional terms, like that would change the paper trail sitting in my attorney's file drawer. I didn't respond. I gave him 2 weeks of silence. In that time, I received emails from two of his friends, people I'd met once or twice during the wedding, people who had barely acknowledged me before. One asked if I could find compassion. Another tried to imply that my mother wouldn't want to see her husband homeless. I ignored both. Brian had a pension, a savings account, and another condo he'd once mentioned owning out in the valley. He wasn't homeless. He was being held accountable. At week 3, he finally called my attorney directly, left a voicemail asking if there was a way to delay enforcement, and requesting a meeting to clarify expectations. My attorney called me the next morning and laughed. He thinks this is a negotiation, he said. It's not. That was the week Brian tried to fight back. It started with him posting on Facebook again. This time it wasn't performative grief. It was a long-winded rant about entitled children and families who turn on you the moment your partner passes. He didn't name me, but he did need to. Mutual acquaintances tagged me, sent me screenshots. He painted himself as a grieving widower being kicked out by a vengeful stepson who couldn't bear to share his mommy. The comments were exactly what you'd expect. People offering sympathy, people sharing their own family horror stories, people validating every false word. I still didn't respond, but I documented everything, every post, every message, every email. I kept them all. Not because I planned to sue for defamation, I didn't care what strangers thought, but because I wanted a record of how he chose to behave when the illusion cracked. 3 days before the deadline, I visited the house again, this time with my attorney and a local sheriff's deputy. We didn't go inside. We just delivered one final letter in person. Not to Brian directly, he wasn't home, but to the mailbox, taped and photographed with witnesses present. The letter stated that if he was still in the house after the deadline, we would initiate formal eviction proceedings with the court and file for damages related to unauthorized occupancy. That night, I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Brian. Congratulations. You finally got what you wanted. I hope you're proud of yourself. I read it twice. Then I deleted it, because this had never been about pride. It had never been about revenge. It was about restoration, about ensuring that what belonged to my mother didn't end up in the hands of the man who saw her death as a land grab, about making sure that the house she built with her bare hands didn't become his trophy. On the 30th day, I drove to the property. The front yard was empty. The gravel patio set was gone. The Bluetooth bench was missing. The porch swing hadn't returned, but there was space again, open, untouched, silent. The locks had been changed back. The house was empty. And for the first time in almost a year, it finally felt like hers again. When I stepped into the house that morning, the first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind of emptiness that comes with abandonment, but the kind that comes after something toxic has finally been removed. The air felt still again. For the first time since my mom passed, the place didn't feel like it was suffocating under someone else's presence. It was clean, not just physically, but spiritually. He was gone. Brian hadn't taken everything. A few of his things remained in the garage. A rusted set of golf clubs, a broken bar stool, some unopened mail. I boxed it all and had it delivered to a P.O. box he'd left with my attorney. I didn't throw anything out, didn't keep a single piece. There was no need. I wanted nothing of his left behind. I wasn't keeping trophies. I was closing a chapter. I walked room to room for nearly 2 hours that day, just observing, touching the walls, opening windows, letting sunlight spill back into places he had painted over or blocked out. The garden was still bare, the flower beds empty, the soil dry. I took a photo of it, not to preserve the damage, but to mark the starting point of everything I'd bring back. The swing on the porch would be the first thing to return. Then the roses, then her books, then her chair. I didn't move in. I could have, but I didn't need to. I had my own place, my own life. The house wasn't my retreat. It was my responsibility. My mom's legacy, protected exactly the way she intended. So I kept the house, restored it piece by piece, and every month I made sure the property taxes were paid in full and on time, something Brian never even thought about. I left a light on in the front hallway, always on a timer, so even if I wasn't there, it never sat in darkness. Brian never reached out again. No phone calls. No letters, no emails. I know he's still around. Someone mentioned he'd moved in with an old friend, that he was starting over. Good for him. I don't care. I wasn't interested in dragging him through court, suing for damages, or punishing him for what he tried to do. I didn't need to. He lost the moment he assumed my mother's name would protect him. He lost the moment he mistook access for ownership. He lost the moment I opened that file cabinet and saw her deed missing, because that's when I started preparing to take everything back. People always talk about justice like it needs to be loud. A confrontation, a courtroom, a scene. But sometimes justice is just a locked door and the sound of your name missing from every document. Sometimes it's as simple as walking through a house that someone else tried to claim, knowing they'll never step foot in it again. I planted the roses that fall, dug into the earth by hand, filled the beds with new soil, added a drip line for watering. It took hours, and the blisters were bad. But when I stepped back and looked at them, blooming again under the same sun they'd always known, I felt something settle in my chest. Not pride, not relief, just closure. There's a photo on the hallway table now, one of my moms sitting on the old swing, smiling into the sunlight, holding a coffee she'd made for both of us. Behind her is the garden she loved. Around her is the house she fought for, worked for, lived in. And beneath that photo, in a small silver frame, is the deed. My name, her name, no one else's.